When both you and the narcissist fall into silence, it doesn't create peace in the way people expect. It doesn't soften the atmosphere or bring emotional closure. Instead, it creates a kind of invisible tension, like something has snapped out of place in the psychological system. And in that space, it is never truly calm. Something important has shifted, and one of you starts to lose control. And it is not you. Most people assume that when communication stops on both sides, it means the connection is finished. But what actually happens underneath is far more complex and unsettling. This is usually the point where the narcissist begins a deeper internal reaction, and at the same time, where your real healing process quietly begins. There is a hidden split here, two completely different emotional realities unfolding at once. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, it's because you're not just hearing a story, you're stepping into a psychological pattern that repeats itself until it is fully understood. And understanding it is what finally breaks it. When contact stops from both sides, the first stage on their side is something that can be described as a recalibration phase. It is not obvious. It doesn't look emotional. In fact, it happens almost entirely in the background. No big reaction, no immediate chase, no visible panic, just silence that seems calm on the surface but is mentally active underneath. Music. From your perspective, silence often feels like space. It feels like distance from chaos, like a boundary finally being formed, like your nervous system getting a chance to settle. It feels like recovery beginning. But from their perspective, silence is not experienced emotionally in the same way. It is not processed as reflection or accountability. It is processed as information. Your absence of response becomes something they analyze rather than something they respect. Instead of asking themselves how they affected you, their mind shifts into evaluation mode. They start trying to explain the gap. Did you get busy? Are you trying to punish them? Is someone else influencing you? Are you testing them? Their attention moves toward possibilities, angles, and hidden meanings. Music. This is because narcissistic thinking is not built around emotional reflection. It is built around interpretation and control. So your silence doesn't become a mirror for self-awareness. It becomes a puzzle that needs solving. Uncertainty, for them, is not neutral. It creates internal discomfort that pushes them to regain clarity in whatever way they can. During this recalibration phase, they may not reach out at all, and that can confuse people. It can look like indifference, but it is not. In many cases, it is strategy. They often observe instead of acting. They may check your online activity, look at your interactions, or silently track who is still around you. Music. This is not emotional processing. It is monitoring. They are collecting data to understand whether their influence is still intact or if something has shifted beyond their control. Deep down, there is still an assumption that people who were once emotionally engaged will eventually return to the pattern they created before. So your silence is rarely interpreted as final. It is interpreted as temporary disruption. That belief is exactly why they don't panic immediately. Instead, they wait. They expect the old cycle to resume. They expect you to break the silence first, like before. They rely heavily on repetition, on emotional patterns they trained into the dynamic over time. Guilt responses, emotional forgiveness, the desire to restore peace, fear of escalation, all of these are part of what they count on. But when you don't respond, something in that internal system begins to shift. The recalibration becomes more active. The questions intensify. The sense of control starts to feel less stable. And this is where the shift becomes psychologically important. Silence in their inner world is never neutral. It is either something they can eventually overcome to regain influence, or something that signals loss of control. Music. And the longer that silence continues, the more unstable that sense of control becomes, because what they are really reacting to is not absence, it is unpredictability. For you, however, silence carries an entirely different emotional weight. You feel the loss in a deeply personal way. You are not analyzing the situation, you are living through it. You are carrying the emotional aftermath, the confusion, the unanswered questions, and the internal exhaustion that comes from prolonged emotional strain. This is where your silence begins to function as recovery. You are no longer feeding the cycle. You are trying to regulate your nervous system, reclaim clarity, and rebuild a sense of identity that was stretched or fragmented inside the relationship. That process can feel heavy. It can come with sadness, withdrawal, doubt, and reflection. You are not just missing a person, you are processing what it cost you to stay connected. Meanwhile, on their side, there is no similar emotional depth being processed. They are not sitting with reflection or grief in the same way. The silence does not automatically lead them into emotional accountability. Instead, the first layer of response is often irritation or inconvenience. That is because what they were receiving from the connection was access to attention, reactions, validation, emotional engagement, even conflict. All of that served a function for them. When you go silent, that stream stops. Music. But instead of interpreting it as emotional loss, it is experienced more like interruption. Something that was available is no longer available. Something predictable has become unavailable. And that shift creates discomfort, not emotional grief. So while you are processing pain, memory, and emotional withdrawal, they are processing disruption and access loss. These are two completely different psychological languages. You are dealing with attachment and meaning. They are dealing with availability and control. As time continues, this difference becomes more visible. You begin to see the emotional imbalance more clearly. You start recognizing how much of yourself was previously invested just to maintain stability in the dynamic, and they begin to notice something else, that the usual emotional triggers are no longer producing a response. What used to bring a reaction no longer works the same way. That is where frustration increases on their side, not because they are experiencing emotional loss in the way you are, but because the system they relied on is no longer responding. And this is the deeper truth behind mutual silence. It does not affect both people equally. One person enters reflection, healing, and emotional separation. The other enters recalibration, observation, and control-based interpretation. Eventually, your silence becomes something far more powerful than absence. It becomes a disruption to the psychological structure they were depending on. And that disruption is what shifts the entire dynamic, because silence from someone they once influenced no longer feels passive. It feels like resistance. And resistance is something they cannot easily ignore. They interpret your silence as defiance, even when your intention is something far simpler: self-protection, emotional distance, or the need to finally regain clarity. In their internal framework, silence is rarely neutral. It is not seen as calm or healing. It is experienced as resistance, as a challenge, as evidence that their influence is no longer guaranteed. That is exactly why silence can affect them more than open conflict ever did. Conflict still keeps them in the center of your attention. Even arguments confirm that there is emotional engagement, that there is still a link, still relevance, still a role they are playing in your inner world. Even anger, as intense as it may be, still keeps the emotional channel open. Music. Silence does something very different. It removes them from the interaction entirely. It takes away the stage they were performing on, and for someone who is used to being emotionally central, that removal feels destabilizing. It interrupts the narrative they depend on, that they matter in a way that guarantees continued access to you. When your silence continues, it forces a confrontation with something they usually avoid: the possibility that their importance, control, or emotional dominance is not as secure as they believed. And because ambiguity is deeply uncomfortable for them, they struggle to sit with not knowing what your silence actually means. Instead of interpreting it as a boundary or emotional recovery, they often reshape it into something else in their mind. It becomes framed as disrespect, rejection, manipulation, or even a hidden strategy. Your distance stops being seen as exhaustion and starts being interpreted through suspicion. Music. This is where their thinking becomes internally distorted. They may convince themselves that you are trying to provoke a reaction, that you are playing a game, or that your silence has an agenda behind it. The idea that you might simply be withdrawing for your own emotional well-being does not fit easily into their interpretation, so it gets replaced with narratives that protect their ego. Some will shift into a competitive mindset, treating your silence like a challenge they need to win. Others will interpret it as betrayal, rewriting the history of the relationship so that your absence appears unjustified. Even if they were the ones who caused harm repeatedly, the mind tends to preserve self-image first and truth second. As this internal tension builds, their sense of control begins to feel less stable. Your silence becomes a reflection they cannot easily escape. And instead of sitting with discomfort or responsibility, they move toward mental explanations that restore a sense of superiority. They may tell themselves you will eventually return, because that has happened before, or they may begin mentally preparing ways to regain influence, reassert control, or reestablish contact on their terms. The focus is not emotional understanding, it is regaining position. From your side, silence often feels like space. It feels like distance from emotional pressure, like the beginning of recovery, like your system finally having room to breathe. It becomes a process of sorting through what happened, what it cost you, and who you were becoming inside that dynamic. Music. But from their side, your absence creates a very different internal reaction. It creates a vacuum where their usual sense of influence used to exist. Narcissistic structures of self-worth are not internally stable. They are often reinforced externally through attention, reaction, and engagement from others. When that feedback stops, the structure feels disrupted. You were part of that feedback loop. Your responses, your emotional availability, your patterns of returning after conflict, all of these contributed to maintaining the system they relied on. When you go silent, that system loses one of its key sources of reinforcement. And that is where discomfort begins, not necessarily emotional grief, but ego disruption. The identity they built around being influential, central, or in control is suddenly no longer being confirmed in the same way. Without your reactions, there is nothing to push against. Nothing to interpret, nothing to emotionally extract or shape into validation. That absence doesn't just feel like distance, it feels like loss of access. As a result, their mental state often becomes more active rather than calm. They may replay earlier interactions, searching for moments where control may have slipped. They may wonder if someone else has taken their place in your attention. They may begin scanning for ways to reinsert themselves into your awareness even without direct contact. Music. The silence feels louder for them precisely because it is unclear. They do not have visibility into your emotional world anymore, and that uncertainty removes their ability to predict or manage the situation. They are no longer at the center of the dynamic, they are outside of it. That shift triggers instability in their internal narrative. It moves from certainty to doubt, from entitlement to suspicion, from assumed control to perceived loss of position. And when both sides fall into silence, what looks from the outside like nothing happening is actually two completely different psychological processes unfolding at once. One is moving toward healing, reflection, and emotional separation. The other is moving through recalibration, control seeking, and ego restoration. Eventually, this imbalance becomes clearer. Because silence does not affect both people equally, it reveals what each person was getting from the connection in the first place, and what happens when that access is no longer available. They adjust their tone to whatever they believe might still work, because at that point, the objective is no longer genuine reconnection. It is the restoration of influence. Control, not closeness, becomes the driving force. If direct re-engagement feels too exposed or uncertain for them, the strategy often shifts into something more indirect, baiting. This is designed specifically to pull an emotional reaction out of you. It does not matter whether that reaction is anger, sadness, curiosity, or even affection. What matters is that you respond. Music. In this pattern of thinking, emotional direction is irrelevant. Positive or negative, your reaction still confirms access. It still places them back in a position where they can influence your emotional state. And that, more than anything, reestablishes their sense of relevance. Silence, on the other hand, removes that confirmation entirely. It creates a gap where their usual influence used to exist. So baiting becomes a way of testing that gap, pressing into it, trying to see if anything still triggers a response. Even conflict becomes preferable to invisibility, because invisibility disrupts their sense of importance. If baiting does not produce the desired effect, the dynamic often escalates into triangulation. This is where a third element is introduced into the picture: another person, an ex, a new connection, or even a loosely connected social figure. But the purpose is not connection, it is positioning. Through triangulation, they attempt to rebuild leverage by shifting perception. They may imply that someone else values them more, show signs of moving on, or subtly present comparisons meant to create insecurity. The underlying goal is to make you question your position, your value, or your replaceability. This is not about emotional bonding. It is about forcing movement, getting you to react, defend, explain, or re-enter the dynamic from a position of emotional urgency. Because urgency restores engagement, and engagement restores control. When you look closely, these behaviors are not signs of emotional depth. They are signs of dependency on external validation. Hoovering, baiting, and triangulation all function as attempts to stabilize a fragile internal structure by pulling reactions from the outside world. They are not expressions of love or connection. They are mechanisms used to repair ego disruption when the usual source of validation is no longer available. As the silence continues, a deeper contrast begins to form. From the outside, nothing may appear to be happening, but internally, two very different processes are unfolding. For you, silence often begins to feel like space. At first, it may feel unfamiliar or even uncomfortable because your system has been conditioned to expect emotional turbulence. But gradually, something starts to settle. The constant anticipation fades. The internal noise quiets. Music. When we break this idea down in a simpler and more grounded way, it is really describing two completely different psychological experiences that happen when a stressful or emotionally intense connection suddenly goes quiet. On your side, the silence often begins as something unfamiliar. If you have been in a relationship or dynamic where there was emotional intensity, unpredictability, or constant tension, your nervous system adapts to that environment. It stays alert. It expects reaction, conflict, or emotional disruption. This state is often called hypervigilance, not because you are choosing it, but because your body has learned it as a survival pattern. So when contact stops, your system does not immediately feel peace. Instead, it may first feel strange, empty, or even uncomfortable. That is because your body is used to emotional noise. Silence feels unfamiliar, almost like something is missing or unresolved. But over time, something important begins to shift. When there is no longer a constant emotional trigger, your nervous system slowly reduces its stress response. It stops preparing for conflict. It stops scanning for danger. This is what downshifting means in practical terms. Your body is moving out of survival mode and into regulation. As that happens, clarity starts returning. Your thoughts become less tangled. You are no longer spending mental energy predicting someone else's moods or reactions. Sleep can improve. Emotional intensity begins to settle. You start having space to think about your own life instead of constantly reacting to the dynamic you are in. This is why silence for you gradually transforms from emptiness into something closer to safety and recovery. At the same time, the other person in this dynamic may experience the same silence in a very different way, especially if they are someone who relies heavily on external validation, attention, or emotional reactions from others to maintain their sense of self-worth. In that case, silence is not felt as space or healing. It is felt as a loss of feedback. Their sense of importance or stability is often reinforced through how others respond to them, through attention, emotional reactions, or engagement. When that response disappears, it removes a source of psychological reinforcement they were used to relying on. At first, they may not fully acknowledge this change. They might act like it does not matter, dismiss it internally, or convince themselves that it is temporary. This is a form of psychological defense. because accepting the loss of influence or connection can feel uncomfortable. But as time passes, the absence becomes harder to ignore. When there are no emotional responses coming back, no reactions to their attempts at interaction, and no feedback loop to confirm their influence, something shifts internally. Their usual sense of impact or control over the dynamic starts to weaken. This is where discomfort appears. Not necessarily emotional sadness in a healthy or reflective way, but more like instability in self-image. It can feel like a loss of relevance, uncertainty about where they stand, or irritation at not being able to predict or influence the situation anymore. It is important to understand that this is less about missing the person in an emotionally deep way and more about missing the role they played in maintaining a certain self-perception. The mirror they were used to seeing themselves in, your responses, attention, emotional engagement, is no longer available in the same way. Meanwhile, your side continues to change in a different direction. As the emotional pressure reduces, your nervous system begins to recover more fully. You start noticing that your mind is not constantly occupied with tension or anticipation. You may find yourself thinking more clearly, reacting less emotionally, and feeling less mentally exhausted. The body also begins to adjust. When stress has been present for a long time, it becomes the baseline. So when it disappears, the system slowly learns that it is no longer in danger. This is why healing often feels gradual rather than instant. It is a process of recalibration, not a switch. As this continues, you begin to reclaim parts of yourself that were previously consumed by the relationship dynamic. Your attention is no longer constantly directed toward analyzing someone else's behavior. Your emotional energy is not being spent on managing conflict or uncertainty. Your decisions begin to feel more self-directed again. This is a key turning point. Your inner world starts reorganizing around you again, instead of around the other person's reactions. You begin to reconnect with your own needs, your own emotions, and your own sense of direction in life. From the outside, it may look like nothing is happening because there is no visible drama or communication. But internally, two very different processes are unfolding. One side is slowly moving into regulation, clarity, and recovery. The other side is experiencing discomfort due to loss of feedback, reduced control, and instability in self-image. And this contrast is what makes the silence so significant. It is not just the absence of communication, it is the moment where two completely different emotional systems reveal how differently they function when the connection that once kept them linked is removed. In conclusion, silence in this kind of dynamic is never just nothing happening. It becomes a turning point where two completely different internal experiences unfold at the same time. For you, the silence gradually transforms into space for recovery. The nervous system that was once stuck in stress begins to settle. Mental clarity returns, emotional reactivity reduces, and slowly you start reconnecting with yourself instead of constantly reacting to the other person. What first feels like emptiness eventually becomes calm, stability, and self-awareness. For them, however, the same silence creates a different internal reaction. Without emotional responses or attention to rely on, the feedback that once supported their sense of control and self-image begins to disappear. This doesn't create healthy reflection. It creates discomfort, uncertainty, and instability in how they perceive their own influence. And that is the core contrast. What feels like peace and healing for you feels like loss of control for them. What feels like recovery for you feels like disruption for their ego-based structure. Over time, this difference exposes the deeper truth of the connection itself. It was never balanced in the way it appeared on the surface, and when the noise is removed, what remains is clarity. You begin to return to yourself, while they are forced to adjust to a version of reality where they are no longer at the center of your emotional world.